Greetings from the Good Forest. Last time we considered nature as the first of four lenses through which to view Yusovania. The first of four categories, each constituting a kind of collective entity or forest in itself. The second category to be covered here is that of companionship, that is, company, fellowship, association. Companion derives from come, meaning together, and panis, meaning bread. A companion is thus one with whom you would share bread. Companionship, of course, is sometimes applied with respect to more intimate company, but we can think of it as encompassing more broadly all of those with whom we would consider sharing a meal. The members of this collectivity, the trees of this forest, as it were, comprising all the family, friends, and acquaintances that make up our living community. The category of companionship also covers the more abstract ways in which we live among others, through the larger economy, for example, and as residents and citizens of a particular place. Just as in the presentation on nature, we'll spend the first part of the discussion tracing out some general issues and challenges that can be identified within this quadrant, before moving on in the second half of the presentation to possible Yusovanian responses. It's worth noting that many issues are highlighted in the four presentations of this series, but none are thoroughly detailed, explored, or defended. Our purpose here is to attempt simply to take inventory, mapping a quadrant's territory in only the most preliminary way. All of the four presentations are designed, as it were, to get us into the wood, to get our feet muddy in the issues of the quadrant, and to start us on the task of opening up a trail. Let's look then at some of the widely regarded large-scale benefits that may be observed in this quadrant of companionship. We can see, first of all, with respect to the very nature of our communities considered historically, an obvious expansion in the size of our cooperative societal systems, with an accompanying expansion of trade, increased division of labor, and development of complex economic systems. In our current age, we can see, on a scale never seen before, a vast movement not only of goods, but also of people and financial assets. This trend of great shiftability is being accompanied as well by one of greater clustering and convergence, as reflected in the increasing collection of people and resources in urban centers around the world. The growth of knowledge that has come through greater division of labor, that is, through increased specialization, has fostered breakthroughs, for example, in energy use and distribution, seen for instance in electricity generation. In transportation, we can think here of railways and automobiles. And in communications, radio and television come to mind, and more recently, the internet. In addition, we can see, at least by certain measures, an extraordinary decline in poverty throughout the modern period, fueled by developments, for example, in agriculture and medicine. It's been argued indeed that through greater interconnections in trade, food shortages have become less common, living standards have risen, and political conflicts have diminished both in frequency and severity. It's been contended as well that greater individual freedoms and privileges have been realized through the increased complexity and richness of our social systems, as seen particularly in self-regarding democratic orders of government in the West, and as attested more specifically through the prerogatives and powers there of new urban and suburban classes. To be sure, the growth of our social systems, on display most prominently in the metropolises of our nations, has surely led to a whole host of emancipatory consumer practices and novel, often welcomed civic identities. We are free in ways never even imagined in eras past. But such freedoms, along with other identified boons of modernity, have come with costs and defects that are often downplayed or obscured. There is indeed a shadow side to the manner in which our societies have evolved. One enormous flaw is tied up with the presumption of unsustainable resource expenditures. Our socio-economic model presupposing a state of incessant and uninterrupted growth, which is in conflict, of course, with pre-existing energy restrictions and ecological boundaries. We are not, however, encouraged to see such things. Indeed, there is great opaqueness built into our energy systems, in such a way as to shield end consumers from an awareness of potentially pernicious system effects, including issues not only of resource depletion, but also those of pollution and habitat despoliation. Also hidden or obscured is the emergence of environmentally and socially destructive supply chains, as well as debilitating, sometimes dangerous transnational energy dependencies. These are issues, of course, that are of great relevance to the nature quadrant, discussed last time, but given their economic significance, they are closely tied to the companionship quadrant as well. Beyond such issues, we may observe that as states and federations have grown larger and increasingly intertwined, they've opened themselves up to still other kinds of perils. Threats of attack, for example, by borderless cartels and outside insurgents. Heightened exposure to viruses, whether biological or computer-based. And greater risks to the financial machinery that make our economies run. Additionally, considering the rapid influx and outflux of goods, capital, and people, communities in the modern world have become prone to easy disruption, dislocation, and disability, sometimes without any consent of the people concerned. Indeed, with the expansion of our cooperative systems, we have increased the ease by which they may be co-opted by various special interest groups. An expansion that in many ways has in fact decreased democratic political powers, even as other kinds of consumer freedoms have multiplied. Considered historically, there has been an observable and in many ways laudable shift away from elite classes based on inherited birthrights and landed estates. But of course we've swapped these figures for a different elite, one that's professedly more meritocratic in its nature. The word elite comes from elegere, meaning to choose or select. Its use in modern political contexts suggests that there's still a selection or sorting process taking place. There's still a choosing that is wrapped up in our supposed meritocracies. The nature of this meritocracy can and should be examined and questioned, for the theory and practice of merit implies in itself a certain set of values, which are necessarily foregrounded at the expense of other values, other visions of civic worth and identity. Modern measures of merit typically prioritize values not of land and people, of environment and community, but of commerce and capital, of general economic enrichment and personal pecuniary gain. Also to be questioned is the sheer scale at which this meritocracy, this monetary merit-making, is meant to unfold. For a true democracy, the political arrangement under which we supposedly operate becomes increasingly less tenable as societies become larger and increasingly interlinked. Even in the best of electoral systems, rule over such large electorates will tend to be relegated more and more to unelected civil servants, politicians in such large systems likely aligning with the recognized prime movers of big society. In today's world, these are assorted transnational capital interests, some of which conduct their business quite prominently in the public eye, while others operate quietly, sometimes furtively behind the scenes. Throughout the modern period, we see a tendency of ever-increasing centralization of socio-political power and control, first at the level of nation-states, and later at the level of international institutions, including various intergovernmental bodies, trans-global corporations, financial firms, and self-regarding activist not-for-profits. As the polis has grown larger, the polity has become weaker. The extension of our economic powers and reach have often come at the expense of political disenfranchisement of one form or another. Scale alone can work against the demos, the people. Larger and larger collectives producing increasingly nominal and meretricious forms of democracy. Quantity affects quality. There is indisputably a never-before-seen cornucopia of economic offerings, but these often come at the expense of truly communitarian principles and practices. As a social collective, we have the potential ability to make choices that entail relative economic sacrifice in the interest of preserving communal resources and reserves, but the issue is rarely framed as such. We can think of the social patterns of a particular place or people as maintaining a kind of ecosystem, much as in the nature sphere, and as generating, in the terminology of our day, a kind of social capital. Determinations regarding such social capital are rightfully disclosed, discussed, and weighed in light of any proposed changes to the system, including, for any given body politic, alterations concerning its size, makeup, and terms of civil engagement. Special interests standing to gain from particular changes have, of course, a tendency to resist and deflect such interrogation and discussion, as it may curtail profits or impede in the realization of other perceived gains. Naturally, then, the identification of special interest incentives and of possible ways of offsetting and overcoming them should be included in one's framing and investigation of these matters. The foregoing offers a brief sketch of just a few of the issues relevant to the companionship sphere as seen in a large-scale collective sense. We can also look at issues of community and sociality from a more subjective standpoint, from the standpoint of individual experience. Seen at the level of the commercial subject, a widespread socio-economic trend today appears to be that of a broadening of one's social reach and action potential, at least for many, often at the expense, however, of one's depth of interaction and involvement. One could say that there are more opportunities for an individual to move and explore than in previous periods, but perhaps also more superficially and with less allegiance and loyalty to particular locales, both on account of the limited capacities of any given individual. There is difficulty in connecting deeply to many peoples and places, and also because of changes to the socio-cultural landscapes through which that individual may pass. Landscapes that have become discernibly more shallow and uniform with the growth of various transnational corporate interests. Our communities feel in many ways more transient and transactional, our social spaces having become more noticeably commercialized over time, as seen both in actually interactive spaces, in corporate-run malls for instance, and more recently in virtually interactive spaces. Social media companies implementing there a veiled strategy of data extraction and marketing. In a way complementary to an alienation from nature, we can observe in the companionship sphere an alienation from one another that has indeed become a recognized hallmark of modern societies. Strangely, perhaps, given that we are more interconnected than ever before. With the general broadening of the social sphere, we can see an evident shallowing of it as well. The increased changeability and commodification of our social spaces, leading to changes, in fact, in the human subject. More specifically, the formation of one's personal identity has become manifestly more fluid and mutable, seen both with regard to any number of external impacts and pressures upon the individual, as well as his or her own internal constructions. Erstwhile identities anchored in family networks and in particular geographies have given way to identities tethered to broader economic offerings and more abstract social significations. identities that are more ephemeral and amorphous in their makeup than those of eras past. Alterations to the technological landscape have allowed for new and ever larger forms of social organization, thus facilitating this fluidity and mutability of identity formation. Although perhaps difficult to imagine from today's perspective, one may think historically here on the now conventional technologies of the newspaper and automobile, both of which aided in the construction of broader national identities, often with at least some erosion to identities of intranational regions and municipalities. Moreover, radio, television, and most recently the Internet have brought events and personalities from around the world into one's domestic space in a way that allows for an unprecedented immediacy of connection and interaction. Such technologies hold powers, of course, not only of extensive social connectivity and outreach, but also of mass persuasion and social engineering. An individual's selfhood has become, in this technologically mediatized environment, a kind of managed product, to be shaped potentially according to the needs and desires of third-party handlers. This kind of mediatized acculturation process has been accompanied in very recent times by corporate and also governmental harvesting of demographic and behavioral data, as powered by developments in information technologies, allowing in effect an even greater degree of management and manipulation. In response to this mediated social environment, we've become, through the use of our recent communication technologies in particular, more fixedly attuned to media-generated social signals, more saturated by and more reactive to far-flung sources of social information, more hypersocial, one could say, but in strangely unfulfilling and isolating ways. The bounty and surplus of our societies have created a number of hazards that were much less common in eras past, if they were perceptible at all. Perils of excess and eccentricity, of mental and physical malnourishment. Our unparalleled affluence has led, to the surprise and bewilderment of some, to a reported rise in rates of anxiety, depression, and antisocial behavior. Substance abuse has increased by many measures, with other sorts of dependencies proliferating as well. Excessive amounts of screen time may also be noted here, although typically it's only mildly pathologized, if at all, most likely on account of its cultural pervasiveness. In older generations, television, of course, is the medium of choice, with computer and phone-based media predominating in younger generations. As a number of social science studies reflect, we can see our family structures eroding, our friend circles shrinking, trends that have been exacerbated in recent decades especially by increased demographic thinning and dispersal. Tight communities at the local level often being replaced by a loose web of distant contacts and correspondence. We may ask, are we socializing ourselves in ways that augment feelings of apprehensiveness, dejection, and a peculiar sense of isolation? Are we creating societies that oddly alienate and unsettle individuals, even as they produce conditions of unprecedented material largesse? As the West, and indeed the world, has grown more huddled through urbanization, it has grown more hunkered as well, hunched over various forms of technology, holding merely to atomized forms of personal space and meaning, strangely connected in its feeling more disjoined. There are worrying signs of widespread demoralization in our societies and of increased decadence in our socio-cultural practices and pursuits, the fruits of our dissipation and debasement being methodically farmed by firms that are set on such ventures. Yielding before campaigns of manufactured appetites and ambitions, we've become, by many measures, more prone to injurious distraction, short-sightedness, and empty indulgence. More dependent on various commercial interests, some of which can be considered predatory, and less self-reliant, self-determined, and self-sustained. There is a widespread thirst for authenticity in our social systems, often without one's knowing where to turn. Such a longing for deeper identity, in fact, helps in the fueling of market-based identities. For those who are deficient in the companionship sphere, there is a kind of vulnerability or susceptibility to marketed products and sponsored ideologies. Despite such ill effects, it seems that we are normalizing this lack of companionship, some having grown up knowing society only with reference to its commercial features, with little feeling for something greater, for something more cohesive and coherent. We've grown tolerant of these trends, but tolerance is not sustenance. It's not a condition by which to thrive. A Usofanian perspective seeks a new appreciation of community in our hyper-individualized modern world. Just as we grow larger through our identification with nature, so we also grow larger through our identification with those around us. Those with whom we would break bread are those that can be considered as a kind of nourishment or bread themselves, nurturing us as true companions, as family, friends, and fellow walkers. We recognize the living powers of community, seeking to cultivate its virtue while minimizing its vice, revivifying in the process commonly neglected notions of social communion and embrace. Just as we are part of systems of nature, so we are enveloped in systems of companionship, nested as we are in layers of community. There is an acknowledged need here, in a Usofanian context, to ground our social interactions in nature, to avoid getting lost in various mediatized forms of hypersociality. This promises the fostering of a deeper sense of us, both as individuals and as collectives. We are supportive, therefore, of garden and wild spaces, not just for the purpose of minding our connections with nature, but also for the betterment of our social ties. Within our extant social frameworks, the state has come to handle the economy in an abstract sense, with individuals pursuing matters of economic self-interest. But we should question this emphasis on economy. We should question how we run house this way, house or dwelling, oikos in Greek, forming the basis of not only the word economy, but also the word ecology. Humility is desirable here, as in the nature realm. It's about finding the humus or ground for our economy, which we may say is rightfully considered within the wider framework of ecology. The word economy implies rules or regulations, its root word nomos meaning to manage or administer. Before establishing the rules or regulations of this house or oikos, before our economy in other words, we need an ecology, a study of this house as that word implies, knowing what we can of its deeper patterns and tendencies. This is an ecology not only of the non-human realm, but also of what we can think of as an ecology of man, as can be gathered through various psychosocial findings concerning the ways in which humans conduct themselves in aggregate. We are a nature within a nature, which can be seen not only with regard to our place in the greater wild, but also in a social sense, for the social ecosystems in which we live can indeed shape us in profound ways, and should be respected given their far-reaching effects on our individual thoughts, actions, and aspirations. These social ecosystems cannot be fabricated at will, but they can, through deliberate and sustained effort, be nurtured over time, in a direction that is broadly healthful and life-affirming. Looking back over recent history, we can see a persistent push for various modes of commercialized conduct, and market-based lifestyles, with an eye toward profitability and economic growth, in many cases to the detriment of other interests and values. A prioritization, in our view, that's worth reconsidering. Underpinning such growth models, we may observe a pervasive application of reason to society that has led to a kind of economism, and with it, increased bureaucracy and statism, with a view not to humans per se, but to human capital, human resources. Efforts to scientize society, to rationalize it for the purposes of economic productivity and growth, has led as well to an assortment of exploitative business practices and a homogenization of the cultural landscape, thereby affecting changes to the social fabric that undermine community connectivity, hollowing out sources of communal meaning and trust. We seek, from a Usselvanian viewpoint, to guide and govern this very objectification process, this impulse to scientize the social, to economize the demos, rediscovering where necessary the structures by which bona fide communal bonds are engendered and enhanced. The community breathes, it lives, but it needs space, time, nourishment. Although community may be profitably construed as an object to be studied, it's even more beneficially framed as a subject, as something animate, organic, and responsive to our care. We become more powerful by feeding it, by acting as its warden, and also submitting as its charge. With a look to our current communities, we may observe that a personal sense of social service and support has been lost, at least to a certain degree. This should be regenerated where possible. We thus encourage the development and strengthening of community ties, first in an abstract sense, if not in contexts more concrete, learning to look with reverence upon the community as it could be, and seeking methods by which to foster a feeling for the commonwealth. We strive thus toward greater mindfulness of the mental and behavioral effects of various technologies, conventions, and norms, sifting where possible the harmful from the helpful, seen both at the level of the individual and of the larger social group. A balancing is called for here, in which we mind the benefits of recent forms of socialization and communication, but with greater understanding of the entailed costs, choosing in certain ways to opt for older, less mediated forms of interaction, valuing, for example, nature-based encounters and activities that help in our collective identification with the greater wild. We can see this as a kind of social radicalism, a quiet, internally focused radicalism to be sure, one that complements our radicalism in the nature realm. Here in the quadrant of companionship, there is an idea of getting back to roots that takes heart in older notions of community formation, for we seek to conserve and promote time-tested ways of interaction, without, however, losing sight of modern realities. We recognize, therefore, the irreplaceable power of face-to-face encounters, of in-person events, especially recurring ones, those that carry the possibility of seeing attendance again. These are the seeds of true community. These are the means by which companionship blooms. We champion events in particular that prioritize community over commerce, that highlight our connection to the earth and to each other, without the mediation of third-party brokers who place earnings before alliances, avidity before amity. This type of event can already go a long way to decommodifying our interactions, to redefining the social, to reimagining what it means to be us, both as individuals and as cooperative groups. Such collective experiences, however, can carry a community only so far, for group cohesion is generated in large measure through the cumulative effects of countless one-on-one interactions between its members. This often starts through simple gestures of courtesy and kindness, extending then not only to assorted pastimes and pleasures, but also to offers of hospitality and aid. Such offerings can assume, of course, a variety of different forms. Looking to one's neighbors, it may mean the sharing of personal goods and services, the hosting of a meal, or the organizing of an outing. It could also mean, in view of travelers, the granting of short-term accommodation, and for those more remote, the teaching of a transferable skill. We would claim that for the sake of community, what is crucial in each case is that such offerings are transacted without the exchange of money, trading instead in the currency of mutual goodwill. These are the paths to fellowship and friendship. These are the ways in which communities become strong. We are furthermore supportive of family as the true engine of society. When it goes awry, the integrity of larger and more complex community structures can become difficult to sustain. The family, perhaps quite obviously, is where community begins. We acknowledge, therefore, the virtue in family formation and stability, and the construction and maintenance of community support networks in pursuit of this. Indeed, we invite the founding and growth of new cultural institutions that help strengthen our communities and promote cross-generational bonds, looking to the areas, for example, of social service and support, of the arts and education, of sports and recreation. We see too a need to resuscitate forgotten virtues of faith and fortitude, of loyalty and good works, of modesty and thrift. Virtues that are indeed still relevant, but that have been cast in modern commercial contexts as old-fashioned and even obsolete. It takes courage to yield before a community, to submit to the task of its maintenance and care, and we're undoubtedly out of practice. But community can be resuscitated, it can be regained. We live, of course, within pre-established matrices of governmental and non-governmental oversight. This is not something that can be changed quickly, if it is deemed worth changing at all. Even granting this relative inflexibility of extant social orders, there is much we can do at the level of small community formation. With the goals of nature and companionship in mind, we thus find it laudable to consider the formation of relatively independent, self-sustaining communities, not by any means losing touch with broader society, but not being swept away by it either. Consideration should also be given to the introduction and maintenance of virtual communities, with the expectation, however, that this leads back in various ways to the real world, to fully engaged interactions. We shouldn't, of course, give up on national and international solutions to socio-economic problems, but a Usselvanian approach considers community on a smaller scale. The larger social domains in which we all live may be considered in a practical sense as outside the realm of Usselvania itself. It is an outside beyond our outside, a forest that extends beyond the forest. It's for us to find a place, to make a space, in adapting to this larger forest, this greater social wild. We should indeed stretch our imaginations with the aim of valuing and appreciating other communities, but also with the admission that intercommunal boundaries and peaceable differences are an acceptable and in many cases unavoidable component of social maintenance and health. We of a Usselvanian outlook seek therefore a layered method of community formation, allowing for the possibility of divergent groups to agree to disagree, as it were. Some bonds, we can say, are more kindred, others are more contractual. It's a nested approach that follows from our very finitude, locality, and boundedness as human beings. Usselvanian prospects notwithstanding, there is undoubtedly virtue in starting where you are, in looking to your local community as a place in which to first exercise these principles. We should indeed cherish the communities already given to us, helping in what ways we can to cultivate and preserve them. Granting this, we find it beneficial to nurture more distant connections with people of like mind. For today's virtual communities can become, through careful planning, tomorrow's actual communities. We thus, as purveyors of this Usylvanian perspective, would like to do our part in providing kindling for such community creation, offering a space over time in which others may gather, a good forest indeed in which others may grow. Our objectives in the nature realm can be facilitated through the fostering of these companionship principles. By aligning our outlooks and acting in concert, we can overcome nature and community-related challenges that would prove insurmountable for any given individual, helping to bring programs of self-support and sustenance to fruition, while also beaming a light into the greater social wild. There are challenges, however, in the very formation of communities, in the reaching of a consensus concerning the rules and practices by which to live and interact. This is not easy in any case, and there is always the danger of fragmentation and strife. Although there is no way to eliminate absolutely the risk of social fracturing, the harmonizing of social goals is made easier in cases where a social collective, a community in space we could call it, is aligned in its narratives with an identified community in time, one that extends out both into the past and, at least potentially, into the future. Such a community forms the basis of the third Usylvanian quadrant of heritage. This is the quadrant that we'll consider next time.